All right, and I'm going to launch us here to discuss really this third program in a series that the BEI has put together, and really adapting, as all of us have, to the new educational world that we found ourselves in about 3 to 4 months ago, which is that of virtual education. And we've worked through 2 other programs in the last month or 2 that have really gone through effective ways to use Zoom, effective ways to work online and yet maintain that active learning environment. And this third one was really meant to bring together kind of the practical experience that we've had. And in particular, to kind of reflect now after 3 or 4 months, what are some tips, what are some innovations that we've seen? And to kind of anchor that, we've wanted to take forth some lessons from our RISE scholars. So I'm going to introduce who those people are in a second. Before I do that, though, I will take the shameless ability to plug what's coming up and invite you to join a new effort that the BEI is also putting together. Our inaugural session of the BEI Global MedEd Cafe is going to be next Wednesday, 1 week from now. That's 11:30 a.m. Eastern, or whatever time it will be anywhere you are in the world. And so that's going to be a lot of fun, anchoring kind of on an educational topic. This upcoming one will be assessment with an invited expert, which is Professor Vanderbluten, and led by my other co-host for today, and also the lead on this effort, which is Dr. Shuba Ramani. So please mark your calendars if you can for this as well. And if that's not enough, we have more coming out in the fall as well. So we're going to reboot what we had planned for really the late spring, which was talking about CPD, continuous professional development. And we had 3 great sessions lined up that we've just kind of rebooted. And so we're going to reset that in September, October, November. Everything from our partner's vice president for CPD, Bob Birnbaum, to O.P. Hamvick talking about the New England Journal platforms, and then Deb Cully on the Mocha Menet story, which has been very successful. So those should be fun. But let's focus now for the next 40 minutes, 50 minutes or so on this great topic. So the lessons that we've learned about virtual education from our RISE scholars. So the introduction here is to first lead off with my other co-faculty for today, which is Dr. Shuba Ramani, and she is the lead for this effort called the RISE Scholar Program. I'll also introduce 3 of our new faculty members who are the inaugural members of the RISE Scholars Program, which is Drs. Rachel Blair, Rebekah Sternschein, and Andy Lawton. And my brief just introduction, so you kind of get their perspective, is that RISE was meant to take people who are advanced in their training and just coming on to be faculty and to really grow their skill set in what they wanted to do with their career, which was to become clinician educators ahead. And so this was inaugurated in the Brigham's Department of Medicine with Dr. Ramani as the lead. And over the course of a full year, these were the first 4 individuals who were selected to participate. Both to grow their awareness of education principles and core educational understanding, but also research in the area as well. It's always project-based, so each of them have had a project, and it really allowed them to move forward over the course of the year, anchoring this learning in monthly sessions that were at times integrated also with the BEI efforts, and that was really a joy to bring together this last year. So the scholars are all involved with different multiple efforts, but they're all kind of moving forward as clinician educators, as healthcare educators. So that's their perspective. And as they are going to speak now about their opportunities, their reflections over the course of the last year, or last few months, especially as it relates to virtual education, I asked them what is kind of the perspective that they can speak to. How did their world change in the last 3 to 4 months? And it turns out it worked out quite well because Dr. Blair, Rachel had more of a UME perspective, or for those who are outside of the US, more of a medical student perspective as to how virtual education was changing. And Dr. Sternschein a little bit more as to her focus within the ICU environment and the GME world, and Andy a little bit more outward facing from the Brigham, a little more CPD. They're not going to anchor just on those topics. You'll hear them describe their own experiences as we start, but just so you can understand how we hope to really demonstrate how not only did virtual education change, but different perspectives have led to different opportunities or challenges. All right, so my last 2 slides are this, and then we'll open it up to a discussion. The starting point is, man, did the world change from an education standpoint and every other standpoint somewhere around March the 15th in the United States, and somewhere pending your timeline of where you're living around that point. And it did so because we're dealing with an amazing and unfortunate medical event. And so COVID-19 has thrown everything into disarray, and that afforded a very unique experience for us as educators, which was that we were all forced to really think about changing an entire process of teaching and learning onto mostly, not completely, but mostly a more virtual platform. And so now we're out on the other end, a little bit of it. We've at least adjusted, whether or not we've succeeded, at least we've adjusted through that initial process. So my last slide is this, before we open up a discussion, that I do think increasingly it's fun to, and important as growing educators on this call, all of us to think about both frameworks and to think about educational theory as we kind of walk through anything educationally. And so for the purpose of this discussion for the next 40 minutes, we wanted to really anchor it with the change management framework. And so, just to review a little, what's a framework? And in my view of what a framework is, it's kind of a research-informed or kind of a validated model of some sort for something like course design, for medical education research. It's something where you begin to speak a common language and understand the frame in which you're working. And change management has wide acceptability and experience in the business world, but we certainly can use it here as well because we had to change on the fly. And so with credit here to, again, my co-faculty, Kristina, Dzara, this is kind of a diagrammatic model. And the idea here on the x-axis is that education performance, teaching and learning performance was at some good level. And then lo and behold, a crisis came along, and time here on the x-axis that kind of had to force us to adjust. And so it's likely that our teaching and learning took a drop down and then went through these steps. And the idea here is that as we move forward on these kind of steps over time, we're figuring things out. And if you will, the green lines are some of the facilitators to education, and some of the reds are barriers. And the hope is that we're using this moment to not just come back to normal, but to come back somewhere superior to where we were. And that's how we're going to frame at least our discussion that lies ahead. And that is actually my last slide for now, because the fun of this is to facilitate a discussion. So with Rachel, Andy, and Rebekah as our RISE scholars and our kind of discussants, and then a welcoming in Dr. Ramani, Dr. Dzara at any point for comments as well. The starting point is to have you each describe a little bit, again, your perspective of kind of what was your world that had to transition to the virtual platform. So Rachel, maybe I'll start with you. If you can kind of just describe in a minute or two kind of what happened and kind of the crisis that was in front of you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thanks to BEI and Shuba for putting this on. So again, my name's Rachel. I'm an endocrinologist at Brigham, and my main efforts during sort of the COVID pandemic in terms of education have really been aimed at the medical student level. So I help run the physical diagnosis and reasoning course for first-year medical students. And that was quite interesting because usually in the spring they're doing bedside physical exams and histories on patients. And so we had to obviously rethink that whole paradigm. And then I also help to transition our medical student elective when medical students come rotate on endocrinology to a completely virtual format, because at that time in May, medical students couldn't be in the hospital at all. And so that's sort of the flavor of where I'm coming from. And I will say from a personal level, I had also been redeployed to do some nocturnist shifts on a COVID unit, and then was on endocrine consults in the midst of sort of the peak of COVID. And so it was interesting doing all of that at the same time as trying to sort of transition some of these educational opportunities for students.
And Rachel, along with kind of your perspective, what was kind of the initial crisis feeling, and maybe also the timeline you had to work through?
I got an email in regards to the elective from our program director who said, I don't have which was totally fair and honest. He just said, I don't have the bandwidth to make our medical student, elective virtual right now. Do you want to do it? And I think I had 2 weeks. So it was just sort of like, all right, I guess we're just going to try something and see what, throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and see what sticks. And it worked out, I think, and not to get too much in the nitty-gritty, but I think our elective in particular really lent itself to working out really well. And the other thing that was great is that not that many other divisions were doing virtual electives. So we had tons of interest and tons of interested students because they didn't want to just be at home doing nothing. And in regards to the first years, I would say in that there was much more of a large team who Anita Banka, Kate Johnston, and Naveen Kumar and others who decided, let's use some pre-existing resources like aquifer cases, which we can talk about more later, but let's leverage what's already great and see how we can use that in the curriculum. So not sort of reinventing the wheel, but still trying to get to the same goals.
Yeah. And let me pull in the other two. Rebekah, I think your timeline, maybe, if I'm guessing, was even a little bit more sudden in terms of just the adjustment that you were witnessing or walking through. So maybe tell us a little bit of your world in education and how it transitioned and kind of the crisis moment.
Hi, I'm Rebekah Sternschein. I'm a pulmonary and critical care physician here at Brigham. So I heard the end of what Erik said. Yes, things did change relatively suddenly in the pulmonary and critical care world. I am and continue to be and have been involved in a lot of different educational activities on multiple levels, but what I'm going to sort of focus on for the purpose of this discussion to help us to round out our UME, GME, and CME sort of approach is one conference that I helped to develop and ran through the pandemic. We created an interdisciplinary and interprofessional conference for everyone who was potentially caring for critically ill patients with COVID. And as Rachel described, since she was one of the people who was redeployed, that actually ended up being lots of different people, not just the intensivists and the pulmonologists. And so we ended up having a weekly Zoom-based conference that was a hybrid of a journal club and a case conference. Our primary, if we had to choose a primary group of people that were attending the conference, were all the different subspecialties of critical care doctors that we have here at the Brigham. So we had pulm crit care, anesthesia crit care, neuro crit care, but that was not the end of it. We also had our infectious disease colleagues and rheumatologists, hematologists, oncologists. We had a different complication of COVID that was highlighted each week that we did the conference, and in doing so, we sort of attracted even more people. Each changed the focus of the conference.
And maybe to highlight a little bit there, Rebekah, the diversity of the learner was quite wide in terms of their skill set and also their awareness of all things COVID, perhaps.
So we had not just their specialty, but their profession and their training level. So we had physicians, we had respiratory therapists, we had nurses, we had PAs all participating. Didn't really explicitly have undergraduate level participation, so no medical students unless they were rotating on the ICU team. But we had residents, fellows, attendings, and beyond, people who had retired.
Great. And let me just pull in Andy, and then I'm going to also take a minute to stop with Kristina and see if the chat has anything that we should address in kind of that initial moment. Andy, give us maybe your perspective and kind of the timeline the crisis went ahead.
Sure. Even though Rebekah and Rachel and I talk a lot, I'm still just struck by Rebekah's story and how many things were being balanced at once. I see Rachel having a similar sentiment. I'm Andy Lawton. I'm a palliative care physician and internist in the Department of Medicine and at Dana-Farber as well in the Division of Adult Palliative Care. I, along with actually two of my colleagues, Lauren Greco and Kittis McQuest, who are here from our division, we run a series of communication skills workshops for trainees and clinicians in practice. And the big tension for us was both we got emails from Dana-Farber leadership and emails from the Brigham medicine residency program around the same time, not surprisingly, like the other stories that have been told, saying like either things are going to have to be canceled or you're going to have to do everything virtually. And we have, like others, sort of had an entire spring of courses planned. These courses are very interactive. They involve actors that we sort of spend hours training. And anyway, we had like an entire sort of spring built out that had to be restructured to go virtual.
What's your timeline on that, Andy? What was the timeline to make?
I would say we had had about from when we found out, I would say we had about a month. We probably had a little more time than some of the other examples. The residency program, for example, was very flexible about like as soon as we could turn our course virtual, they were happy to have us do it, but it wasn't like a rigid timeline. And so I would say we had a month or 6 weeks and then we're able to deliver multiple courses, especially to the residents virtually.
So with all of us having heard kind of the three different perspectives, I also pull out a little bit that I think Rebekah had the tightest timeline to make something happen. I think, Rachel, you're kind of in the middle a little bit. And I think Andy had perhaps a little more flexibility. So that's going to probably play into how we dealt with challenges. Kristina, let me just take a break because we're 20 minutes into it. Is there anything in particular on the chat that we should be steering the conversation towards?
Not right now. We did have Rebekah who pointed out that maybe we should check out covidprotocols.org, an amazing open source resource for clinical medicine.
That's great. So with that kind of as our entry point here into it, and the three different perspectives, I want to now kind of dig into what those first few sessions of virtual education were like, and really acknowledging kind of the what didn't go so well and what I quickly learned, kind of thing. And Rebekah, as you were kind of the first to kind of have to make something happen, you might have been the first to experience a little bit of let's try 5 things and see what 2 things seem to work. So maybe you can comment on that.
Sure. Yeah, we had a very short time frame, probably about a week to plan something. But so luckily, I think one of the things that Rachel mentioned is trying to use what we already knew or what already existed in a small way was something that we could do. So there already were conferences, there were educational structures in place where we had a case conference sort of structure within the ICU group. And there was a journal club structure also that was a more siloed sort of journal club that different subspecialties had been doing on their own. And we decided to try to take these 2 things and put them together. Probably the most important thing that I learned early on was find a number of people that will actually work together with you and be able to devote their time to you. That ended up being very challenging because as the ICU size and capacity was fluctuating, people were often not able to participate as much in the planning stages from week to week. But in the first week, we basically had a group of 6 people that said that they were interested, and delegation, an important management principle, is really useful to give everyone a different job to do so that it's not one person doing everything and it becomes more doable to do in a short period of time.
And Rebekah, just to clarify on that, did you kind of mean helping to plan the sessions, but also helping on the Zoom to have someone monitoring the chat like I do and things like that? Is it kind of throughout the educational spectrum where you had to delegate?
So both, yeah. So the specifics of managing a Zoom with 200 plus participants was interesting and was a very steep learning curve, but having more people helping you was very important. But I think that there was a sweet spot of about 3 primary people managing the Zoom, where I can describe sort of when we get into the nitty gritty of it, I can describe how we organized that. But a chat moderator is really key. But also in terms of planning the actual contents of the conference, we had different components of each conference, and rather than having a single person try to organize presenters and discussants for every single part of the conference, having a couple of people, about 2 or 3 people that worked on facilitating and organizing who was going to do what was very helpful, while we were all also wearing many hats and being clinicians as well as educators.
Very much so. And Shuba, let me pull you in. I see you have your hand raised here.
I can't see my own hand. So I just want to, again, express a lot of appreciation for, the efforts of the RISE scholars, Rebekah, Rachel, and Andy. And in general, I would like to emphasize a couple of things. They have not only aimed to be future clinician, educator, leaders, but actually more educational scholars and gain leadership skills as well through the program. So we've been in touch so much. I think we email each other. I don't know, in the middle of the night, I'm responding to all of you. But one of the things I've emphasized to them is it's not just delivering a product, but it's actually thinking about the why and the how. And so educational theory was a big part of, the principles were a big part of how they designed their initiatives. But one of the other things was, I think Rachel, well, that was sort of out of my control in a sense. It comes from HMS and there is a certain structure in place. Rebekah had very little time. She had to transform everything in a matter of days. But Andy had a little more time, and we spent quite a lot of time, and now he's actually studying the initiative. So he's actually taking it one step further towards scholarship.
Yeah, so let me just kind of pull that together, which is we heard from Rebekah that, man, we had to do something right away. And man, I quickly figured out that I needed help doing this. That one challenge, if nothing else, was that it takes a village a little bit to pull off education, especially when you're trying to have the same quality, but a totally different model, essentially. And we heard Shuba say, don't be afraid to kind of reach out to those around you to also anchor what you're doing in kind of the science of education. And there are those who can help with that. And there are definitely those of us who have different expertises in different areas. And so finding your mentor, your help makes a big difference. But Shuba, you had mentioned Andy, and so let's pull him in a little bit. Andy, your timeline was at the opposite end of a little bit, you had a little more time is what I meant to say. And so maybe you can still talk, though, about kind of the challenges the first couple times you did it and what you came up against.
Sure. I think the main challenge was how to teaching communication, like anything, we want it to be engaging and interactive. And I think that's especially true for the content we're trying to cover. And the question was how to do that in an effective way virtually, which is, I think, in one form or another, whatever, the question so many people have been trying to answer. A couple of the challenges that came up, one very similar to Rebekah, there were, in fact, one of our early courses, I remember just scheduling wise, I was like, I can probably do this myself. And I remember calling my colleague Lauren immediately afterwards, and we both pretty quickly decided that you can't run any courses that are at all interactive over Zoom by yourself. And so we've now since then had always sort of a Zoom tech, sort of chat person from our office, from our education office, like co-facilitating the session, and we just sort of only schedule things that way forward, and that's been a huge relief so that the person teaching in the moment doesn't have to sort of try to do everything. The other thing that was a challenge was just a certain amount of like passivity that in a small group room, you would naturally, like, people kind of jump in and engage, and we had to be more directive with people about jumping in about, it's kind of, we love the chat for this session, for example, but for honestly, in our courses, most of what we want people to do is say, actually, what I noticed Kristina doing was this, and I thought it was really great. And we had to actually be very explicit about, for this next activity, we're going to ask you to use not use the chat, but actually just say out loud, unmute yourself. So being very, very explicit, almost like a classroom setting about what we're going to ask you to do and what we're going to ask you not to do. And I think maybe at the beginning we worried about being patronizing. Actually, the directness ended up being very effective.
Isn't that unique, huh? Because when we teach adult learners, I think we assume they're mature enough to understand how to engage and stay quiet. And if you will, you're almost going back to a principle in K through 12. And I would even argue the K through 5th grade, where you have to almost set an expectation for your environment. But yet you pulled that in. And I think the unique aspect here is how you really had to think about your learning environment, your learners as a group, is the way to say it, as an initial challenge. And let's bring it over, Rachel, to you. We'll get Rachel to come in and then come back to you, Rebekah, in 1 second, if I could. Rachel, talk to us a little about your first few times using virtual learning and the challenges you faced.
I just want to piggyback on one thing Andy said. I do think this was not, it was a separate thing, but a session with residents. I think it's so helpful to give your learners expectations. So just like we said, we're going to break you up into small groups. And it's kind of like that K through 5th grade. Like, we want a group reporter when we come back to summarize what your group talked about, just so that it's not this awkward silence of like, oh, I didn't know we were reporting back to the group. So just small things like that make a huge difference. so that you're not just all sitting in silence on Zoom, which I think can be a very intimidating place to speak up. So that was I just agree with him that those setting those expectations on Zoom, because we don't have the like interpersonal cues, is super helpful. And I'll
Rachel, you took an experience though with students where some of it could be content learning of certain topics, but others were meant to be, you're walking around on a clerkship learning from patient experiences and rounding. How did you bring that together?
So I was in a very unique position. I was actually I was the fellow on consults when the first 2 students started. So I was like with them on Zoom the whole day, basically. And so I was able to just sort of observe. We all were on virtual rounds together. We would go through patients, talk through them. And what ended up working best was, I think, again, kind of similar to what we do in analog world, is that we would have rounds, but I would say, like, we might not be able to get to all your questions now. And what ended up working well was having a few dedicated sessions, in the afternoons or later in the week, either with myself or other teachers, to kind of do some targeted teaching at the med student level, because we had a list of 20 intubated, critically ill COVID patients who were on insane amounts of insulin. So we couldn't really, always go into the nitty gritty of like, T3 to T4 conversion or something. The other thing just to note on that, which I think was really helpful, and going back to what Rebekah had mentioned about pre-existing resources, is, for example, the med students all watched these wonderful videos on the physiology and pathophysiology of endocrinology about a year and a half prior. And so we actually sent those out to the students and said, we recommend you watch these either before or in the early days of your rotation, so that we didn't have to sit there and do the T3 to T4 conversion teaching. They could watch that on their own time. And if they were having a slow day on consults, they could do that. So I think it was sort of trying to find the balance between what do we need to do together, that sort of education versus service piece that we always run into, but just more in the virtual world.
Well, and I'm also, I was starting here with like, what are the challenges that you all faced and how did you have to just quickly adapt? But we're quickly coming together, merging that you found solutions, and these solutions and sometimes are bringing us to a higher level. And I'll try and be the mirror back here, and I don't want to put words in your mouth at all, Rachel, but in large part on the clinical learning and in the clinical learning environment, we have had a history of just putting every learner together. Like, you can have a brand new student together with fellows who are 8 years down the road, and we just kind of assume they're all going to learn the same thing from the same environment and discussion. And I think what I'm hearing you say is, when I was more deliberate about where my learner was at, and I learned how to flip the classroom or use other modes, it seems like I was being more efficient at the process.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And you said it much more eloquently, but I agree. Yes.
Rebekah, I had cut you off earlier. I know you wanted to maybe jump in.
Oh, I was just going to say, interestingly, in comparison to Andy's experience and Rachel's experience, but I think Andy with the small group learner, where we had a very large, very diverse group, the same principle applied, but in the opposite way, where I had to be extremely explicit at the start of our sessions. I do not want anyone to speak out of turn until I explicitly tell you that it is time to speak out of turn. Yeah. And we loved the chat function because with 200 plus people, the chat went much faster than anyone could possibly ever keep up with. But it was a running commentary with questions and answers that the participants were posing to one another and answering for one another. And then we had a set time for when people could discuss things. So we actually very, very strongly, aggressively muted everyone and did not let anyone speak during pre-specified times, which is slightly the opposite, but the same principle as holding, where we're being explicit about what we want to happen during our session.
Yeah, and I just want to reflect myself as an educator and just my growth here, which is, boy, I see coming together through this experience, so much of the content of education is being merged with the process of education, right? With controlling that learning process in a thoughtful way, as Shuba was kind of getting at. seem to be really the beginnings to a solution to control the morass of what happened. That I think many of us as educators, when we were told we had a crisis and switched to virtual education, the initial thought was, I'll take everything I'm doing in my current world and just switch it to virtual education. And lo and behold, that didn't kind of work perfectly. And so you had to adapt, and hence that change management framework that we were kind of discussing. I don't know, I'm looking also for, maybe it's actually, Shuba, I see your hand up. So let me allow you a little bit of time to reflect on all that we've gone through so far.
All right, I just typed into the chat box the 5 rules that I had talked about at the last seminar, which was entirely about engaging your virtual learners. And those rules actually were distilled from 2 or 3 articles on the Harvard Business Review, and I stay true to them. In terms of the large group, the 200 people, unless you want to lose them, any more than, I exaggerated the 5-minute rule, but 10 minutes, if you're lecturing beyond 10 minutes, you've lost them. So you've got to keep varying your activity and engage your participants. And you can do in 200. There are people you're going to lose, and that's okay. As long as they hear snippets and learn something, just be happy about it. But the last thing is, despite all those rules that I wrote in accountability and nowhere to hide rule, I'm doing a fair number of international webinars with large groups. And compassion, I should write the compassion rule, which is it's okay, let people hide if they're not comfortable, but they just want to participate and learn passively. It's okay to do that. For example, you may not be delivering the presentation in their first language. They may feel shy about sharing their video. They may feel shy about speaking up. And so it's okay. The very fact that they showed up is when they didn't have to show up. Like school, you have to show up. But if they didn't have to show up, shows interest. So show compassion as well.
No, and that point, Shuba, is so well taken, which is my reflection through the launch of the BEI and then where we've taken it in the last 2 to 3 years has been one of acknowledging there's a big group within all of our environments, wherever we are at, each of us on this call, who would define themselves as a healthcare educator. But it kind of means something different to each of us. Some of us want to go and get that PhD in education. Some of us want to be administrating education, leading a medical school. Others want to just pick up a tip or two, and that's a big spectrum of what you can still gain. And so I totally respect the idea that we each of us kind of jump on for our own purpose and our own reasons, and being respectful of that is key. Kristina, I want to pull you in here a little bit. This is totally a cold call, just so all of you know, but Kristina and I work together every day, so I can do it, which is there's a lot coming forth here in me paraphrasing what Rachel, Andy, Rebekah are saying, and then what the chat is saying, and resources, and check this out. How do you pull all that together without telling someone, you should go back and just listen to the webinar one more time? Is there a way we think about a conciseness or messaging of all that's coming through on the chat box or that you're hearing?
I think we definitely have a sense that there are a number of Zoom features that we can use to bring our learners continually back to us, because online teaching is a little bit draining, and we know that, for both the learner and for the faculty. So chunking our content, using the strategies which have been outlined today, maybe it's having engagements every few minutes, such as someone talking, using a poll, using the chat, or simply just asking people to throw a sign, throw a thumbs up if you're with me, if you're hearing me, those sorts of things. And I think we do have a sense that a couple of people in this room, including Shell, I'll shout out to Shell, that she was able to apply some of these principles in her own teaching with a positive outcome.
Yeah, and I sometimes even think maybe after we're done with this, there's a group of us, a small group that goes back through this and says, hey, there's about 7 great kind of comments that were made, and maybe that goes out as a post podcast, post Zoom kind of thing for all of us who signed in here to say, hey, take these home as your kind of core points that were shared in that chat function. So let me go 10 more minutes if we can, just to back to Rachel, Andy, Rebekah, and then leave some time open for some final questions, make sure we end on time. The question I'm going to throw at them is kind of that change management framework idea again, which is now hopefully you've made it through the crisis adjustment, hopefully, and you've started to troubleshoot, which you kind of were describing. And you probably have reflected on, hey, there's some things here that are value added that maybe, just maybe, in my broad educational world, I'm not going to jettison where I was at. We still need to teach doctors in the clinical setting, but what are you going to bring back or recreate, or what will be value added at a higher level than where we were last, March 15th? And I don't, I don't know if you'll have the exact answer to that, but I'd love for you to reflect on that a little bit. And Rebekah, maybe I'll just kind of start with you. Are you going to keep these going for the 200 people, or how do you think about that?
So that's a great question. We are not keeping them going in the exact same form that they were, but I think that there was a large level of interest that we tapped into that we didn't realize, or maybe I hoped in my heart was present, that everyone wanted to learn together, and we demonstrated that. So we're actually trying to decide how to morph this into something that is not just COVID specific, that we will continue in the future. And I'm talking with the various different ICU directors about how we will form this in the future. And actually the thought is currently to maintain the visual or the virtual platform, actually, because we think that that facilitated the ability to have so many different people in different places there at the same time. And then the other answer to your question, what will you change or what did you learn going forward? The intricacies of managing a very large Zoom-based conference, I could write a list of 15 different things that I learned, but I think that if anyone has to run a very large Zoom-based conference, probably the 2 to 3 really important things that we discovered as we had an experience of trial and error through this was, number one, planning is the most important thing that you can possibly do, and you want to plan so that you seem absurd. We used a script where we scripted out minute by minute what we actually wanted to be doing, so that we were shifting who was speaking and whether we were discussing versus presenting every 5 to 7 minutes during our very short period of time. And it was pretty well oiled by the end, that we knew that we were going to cut people off. They expected it, and we shifted to the next discussion point. And that logistically when sharing screens just doesn't work, letting various different people share their screens. We had a lot of people who begged us to just let them share their own slides, and ultimately, after 2 failed attempts, put our foot down and said absolutely no. We had one master slide deck, one person who was sharing the slides for the whole conference, and that was really important and saved us a lot of time, such that we got many comments from people saying that it seemed so well run. And in our mind, we just said, it's just because we're not letting other people do things. We're just having us run things. So those are probably 2 of the most useful take home.
But let those be, lessons for all of us to reflect on, which is kind of that process that you seem to reach people that you didn't know you could reach, your own learners to a different level. And that, boy, the structure became so part and parcel to making education effective, big things that I think we all would reflect on. Andy, how about you next? What's the learned lesson that could maybe make things better in your virtual world, or that you'll take forward, if nothing else?
Yeah, we're definitely continuing. We'll keep doing our courses virtually as long as needed, and then we'll switch back to in-person when we can. I think just overlapping with your comment earlier about learning environment, I think it's something we've always thought about in our courses, and more from a sense of wanting to create a spirit of play and positivity and engagement. But I think now also pulling in the piece about expectation setting and ground rules, we've now built in, we mostly run like half-day courses, which have worked surprisingly well. And if people are engaged, don't seem to get Zoom fatigue. But now we spend actually like quite literally 30 to 45 minutes about like what are our shared rules for the day, what are the expectations, and what is the culture we want to create for these 3 or 4 hours together, and being very explicit about the sort of culture piece and the technology piece up front has been really helpful and makes the day run much more smoothly, and we'll continue that the intentionality of that we will absolutely continue even when we're not as virtual.
Yeah, and I mean, not only the intentionality, the purpose to education, which I think we're hearing over and over. I want to play off just a tiny bit on what you said, which was the surprise on how well it worked, right? And I'll just give my own story. I'll never forget. I was a week into the crisis, barely able to keep one nostril above water, in my own educational world, when I was reaching out to a few people to kind of get their thoughts on virtual education. And one of the medicine chief residents, who by disclaimer happens to be the husband of Rebekah, I said, how do you think it's going with morning report that you're doing on Zoom? And he said, we're never going back. This is the best thing that could have happened to us. And I couldn't believe my ears at the time. And I knew it was good, and I knew there were ways to do it, but it was transformative because of what has already been said a little bit to him, which was we could reach more people. We're already under an efficiency kind of world where it's hard to fit everything in, and this was saving time, and it was allowing more people to feel engaged. And everyone has their story, so I just wanted to play off Andy a little bit also the hurdle of surprise and getting over the acceptance that it may not be what we're going to full tilt, but it certainly could be something we'll all find is beyond the value we perhaps would have placed in it. Rachel, to you. What's going to be new and normal for the undergraduate medical world moving forward?
So it's interesting because I think for one thing, at least in terms of my little piece of the pie there with the endocrine elective, I had excellent educators give talks on Zoom. I recorded all of them. So now we have this beautiful library of sort of like intro talks for our med students that they can watch. So I think we've really built up sort of our asynchronous learning kind of library, which is really exciting. And I would say, I would echo what actually was mentioned by the medicine residency in terms of my own personal experience with our division educational offerings like Grand Rounds, Case Conference. We have, folks logging in from their community practices, from other institutions, from MGH, from BI. And it's been so exciting to see like 70 people at Grand Rounds instead of the usual like 15, 20 stragglers. So I think at least, as you mentioned, like there is this huge opportunity both for if people have to miss something, being able to watch something later, and then also just like being able to bridge those geographical gaps that previously were, it's a big pain in the butt to go across town to MGH. But if I can just log into their conference, that's a whole nother division that I can learn from. So I think our division is planning to continue to keep Grand Rounds and Case Conferences virtual. And I think we're all benefiting from that.
Well, and I want to throw out there a little bit too, and I'm going to put myself for the first time reluctantly into the older category, but I want to reflect on us as a community in the US and the world, which is, I can reflect back to Khan Academy as the start of really, I think, technological learning and the flipped classroom. And I will argue that somewhere around the point of our junior new faculty members and younger have kind of grown up being much more accepting of technology as such useful and equal at times technology to learning. And those of us older, if you will, it's something different. And we have to adjust to that mindset of learning a little bit. And how different that is. I think now that we've all been through this, those who are in this 30 years and younger age group, there's no turning back on some level. And we're still going to be pulling the older people like myself, perhaps, into how we use this as effectively as we can. So I'm going to invite two things.
One thing.
Go ahead, Rebekah.
I will say, I think the way that Rachel and Andy have created something new that is virtual is different than there's a not so good version where you take a conference that happens in person and you just broadcast it, and that does not work very well. And so I think that's something that someone has to think intentionally about, making a conference into a virtual platform. And as full disclosure, I live in the same house as my husband, so I saw a lot of the medical residency's grand rounds, or their morning report in the morning, and they changed the way that they were doing things. So it's not like it's not just taking that conference that was happening in person and putting it on Zoom. That the changes have to be intentional so that the new environment is actually, you're gaining something from it. Because I'm sure that we've all been part of conferences that are just happening and someone happens to have a Zoom link up and you sort of sometimes hear what's going on and sometimes don't, and no one really is telling you what's happening, and it doesn't feel like a great learning experience.
Well, I love the way to kind of bring that at the end together, which is there's a purposefulness to education, there's an adaptation aspect to education, there's an iterativeness to education to make it well. And I think we should also be reflective that there's a synergy here, that no one is going to say we're going all from live teaching of medical education to like all Zoom. Like that's not going to happen either, right? So it is very interesting to reflect. So I'm gonna, there's 9 minutes left. I know some have to drop off early. I appreciate everyone's attention. I'm gonna do two things. I wanna first invite anyone who wants to begin to put in some questions, or maybe Kristina's already tracking a few. If you could put them in the chat, I'll have Kristina do her best to collate a few that we can pull up at the end to kind of organize that. And the second thing I'm gonna do is actually go through my conclusion slide. And I wanna just share my screen again here if you can see it. That I love always to kind of bring a little bit of my thought process, just my own of education, and the idea that we anchored this Zoom around a framework. And the idea was that we were kind of all speaking a similar language and talking about both the challenges, the barriers, but also the facilitators, and trying to think how we were moving a system of education through these different steps. And so always bring yourself back to that. One of many different frameworks you can use, and then also separate from that, educational theories that you can work around, and you heard Dr. Ramani speak to that as well. The last thing I want to do is share my last slide while we're getting the questions, which is the conclusions that I would bring forth, and I created these conclusions before this whole talk, which is, I think we all still would agree, it's been an amazing and amazingly complex last few months, and it really has been disruptive change, and that's been hard, but we've learned a lot, and we don't want to let those lessons educationally go to waste. And so as an educator, try and link the experiences you've had, both the good and the bad, the observations, the ideas, to some sort of framework educational theory that allows you to give some just meaning and structure to it that speaks a common language but builds on others' validated research. And as you do that, I think it makes all of us understand what we're talking better, but also become better at educating ourselves. The last 2 points, though, are simple. Our experiences were all diverse. You heard that from different perspectives. They were all challenging in different ways, and yet they all adapted, and they all moved forward. And I suspect if we do this call again, which maybe we will, in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, we might reflect back a little bit on how we continue to evolve, and I think that's the hope and the joy. So I wanted to thank everyone for taking the time during your lunch hour or wherever you are in the world, at whatever hour it is, to join us. And I will end, but I think now we're going to open it up to some final Q&A for the last 5 or 6 minutes. And Kristina, maybe you can help to moderate if there are some questions.
Yeah, a couple of things came up that I think are worth discussing. So one thing is how we can build that sense of community among our participants, especially when it's a longitudinal teaching experience. And then also thinking about creating or curating learning materials that translate well to the virtual setting.
Yeah, any thoughts from our panel to start?
Yeah, Erik, I had actually typed in a few things in the chat box. And one of the things that I've learned to do, I mean, I've attended webinars from HBS, from elsewhere, and made mistakes and learned. So let's put it that way. And one thing I do want to say is, I know people keep talking about young and old in terms of, I don't believe it. I think I've learned a lot more, and I'm not young. I've learned a lot more in the last few months, and that my youngest colleagues are still struggling with. So it's all a matter of mindset. And everything I do on the web, especially, I ground it in some educational principles. However, back to the original question, which is, in all these webinars that we've been doing, we have a panel of international speakers. And it's just fun, I think, for participants to see people from Australia to North America and everywhere in between. I think that's so much fun. We introduce ourselves. We just take a couple of minutes and tell people who we are. But the next exercise I always do is we get to know who the participants are through polls, through chats. Where are you from? What is your professional background? What is it that you've come to learn today? And in that, I always say, do you want to contribute? Do you want to share your success stories, your knowledge? And do you want to learn more? Do you want to network? Do you want to feel good? So I create polls that have the cognitive, psychomotor, and emotional, everything in it.
Yeah. And then especially for the smaller groups, probably, where it's easier.
Right. The emotion actually helps. That's your nonverbal, body language, if you like, so somehow getting them engaged. And I tell a story. I'm a storyteller, and I typically tell stories of something a mistake I made that I learned from. And immediately that gets a lot of people engaged, and then it gives them the opportunity to, oh, I've made that mistake too, and forgive themselves, and allows them the license to make mistakes. So
yeah, excellent. Kristina, maybe one more question or two if we're lucky.
Yeah, there was just a little talk about how do you think about the learning materials that you will use to support your virtual teaching sessions?
Oh, Rachel, I'm going to send that to you because you spoke about some advanced learning, flipped classroom stuff.
Yes, so I will, the summary is keep it short. So I've done a lot of sort of 5 to 7 minute videos, exactly as you kind of alluded to, that Khan style video, because people will not watch anything longer than that. So you can, exactly like Kristina said, you can chunk it out. So when I did a talk on pumps and continuous glucose monitors, I did intro, then I did pump type 1, pump type 2, and so that people can sort of say, I'm going to watch this for 5 minutes and then be done, and I'll come back to it later. So that's kind of my key, is if you're making materials, keep them nice and short. And if you can't, then at least put timestamps in at the bottom to say, at minute 10, we're talking about this. At minute 15, we're talking about this, so people can be selective at what they want to listen to.
And maybe the leading question here, Rachel, a little bit is, I know those take a little bit of extra time to make initially, but did they save you time or potentially hope to save you time down the line?
Absolutely. Those pump and CGM videos, and not only did I send them to the med students, I sent them to the new fellows. I said, I'm going to send them to all the rotating residents. Like, they're the same thing that I've said a million times. And so now I don't have to say it a million times. And they're not that professional, but they have the information. So they're good enough.
Kristina, any one more maybe to get in?
Yeah, we have one from Louisa. She just wants to know if we find that participants are more willing to actually participate in a digital platform. Does anyone have a case to share where they were really able to engage participants on Zoom?
Yeah, let's see, Andy, I think you spoke a little bit to having to control it, so maybe that's not the perspective. Well, I'll throw it to you. Is there anything you want to add there? Otherwise, we can bring others in from the panel here too.
Sure. No, I actually think I was actually typing a response to Louisa, which I'll just say out loud, which is that we definitely have noticed that people seem more willing. Like, often we'll ask people, okay, we have this case, who wants to jump in and try to go first? The threshold to just jump in and say, yep, I'll give it a try, seems lower. And our hypothesis is that it's something about again, these are very interactive courses, but something about maybe being in my own environment. I mean, even right now, like I know we're all sort of talking on a panel to this large group, but there is something about sitting in my own desk, in my own space, that makes me feel like there's almost this illusion that it's okay. And I don't have to be quite as inhibited. And so our hypothesis is that's helpful and might be a particular advantage of the virtual space.
I'll add that I think the chat function makes people comfortable in an extremely large group, saying something and not having to speak up or be seen. The other thing that I'll say, so we had a lot of participation on our chat function. The other thing that, thinking about educational theory and what is the framework for why, for my particular experience, why this seemed to work educationally, we were creating this sense of camaraderie where people are in it together to learn together. It definitely, I think, put people's guard down. There wasn't a sense of hierarchy. There was a lot of discussion when you saw people from different backgrounds explicitly saying, I don't know what to do in this situation. And like Andy is saying, we're all coming from our own homes for the most part. And so people were kind of comfortable saying, yeah, me neither. What would you do?
Oh, that's a great point. And the hour has gone by so quick. It's 1 o'clock. I'm gonna stop for the sake of keeping us on time. I wanted to do two things. Thank everyone who joined today, which has just been a great discussion. I also just want to acknowledge the team that it takes to pull this off. So Kristina and Shuba as my kind of co-faculty, Rachel, Andy, Rebekah as our panelists, and just sharing your experiences, Caitlin and Karen and everyone else in the BEI. So there's about 8 people who were involved in making this successful, at least.